Well, it is Tuesday night. That means it's time for Second Look. We have a company of good friends here, and you may be joining us online one way or another later on, or even live, because we are live streaming this. So we welcome you, however you're joining us that way. Sorry for those that are watching online because you cannot have access to our study guide, but everybody here, you'll notice it's in lavender. Beautiful lavender paper. I know, it's kind of fancy schmancy. That's just what was in the copier, and I just let it go. So anyway, get yourself one of those. We'll work through some of that. Let me kind of back up a little bit. We touched on a lot of things a couple of weeks ago when we began to talk about the whole subject of hell, and I don't want to go back and revisit all that. But we looked at what the Bible says about it. And we discovered several things, that it is mentioned many, many times in the Old Testament, New Testament. The word hell shows up in the King James Bible, and that's key. In the King James Bible, it shows up 50-some times, I believe 54 times, in the Old and New Testament, so it's not a small item in the King James Version. The problem is that the word hell is older than the New Testament. It's older than Christianity. It is, in fact, an ancient Norse word, and we talked about that for some time. And that is spelled in modern English, H-E-L, hell. And it had the idea in Norse mythology that it was where those people went who died that were not warriors. But over time, it accrued all of these other notions, and by the time the King James translators come along in the early 1600s, the English people had the idea that hell was a place of eternal torment, as I say, and we went through some of that, but things were added to, and ideas borrowed from all different kinds of civilizations and cultures. Concepts about what hell was like were borrowed from things like Zoroastrianism, which is the Persian religion of fire, and some of the imagery of fire was borrowed from that. It borrowed heavily from Greek mythology. It borrowed heavily from Roman mythology. Borrowed heavily from things like Dante's Inferno. The Divine Comedy is a three-part work by Dante that talks about Dante being taken on a tour of hell by Virgil, the Roman poet. Roman poet Virgil had written about the underworld, and so he is the one, Dante says, that took him through the Inferno. If you've ever read it, it's kind of memorable. It has these 9 levels, descending levels. The first level is not so bad. It's a little uncomfortable, but it's not so bad. But the last level is where the devil himself is. He's encased in ice. He's in eternal torment. He has huge gaping jaws, and in his jaws is Judas. It's where the traitors are. It's where the turncoats are. Those were considered to be the worst, and Judas the worst of the worst. So you had these successively awful levels of hell full of all kinds of torments that were matched to whatever sin had brought you to hell. A lot of the imagery that the King James people are thinking about when they come along to translate the scriptures for us into English, they have borrowed and they have added on from all these different sources. They've added on from sources like different artists in the Middle Ages. There was a prominent artist named Hieronymus Bosch. He was a fanciful artist that loved to depict demons and the underworld. And from him and from Dante and from Milton's Paradise Lost, which is the story of how the devil is cast down and comes to be what we know of as the devil. It's the fanciful tale of how that happened. Anyway, borrowing from all of that, they had this concept of hell. that it was eternal conscious torment. The problem is that though the word hell is mentioned 50-some times by the King James translators, they have used that word with all of those concepts attached to it to translate 4 words in the Bible that are not all the same. There's an Old Testament word, and we in our study of Revelation, which we'll get back to one of these days, we have looked at when we looked at the twin problems of the grave and death and the grave. And we talked about them as divine beings and all of that. It's the word, the Hebrew word is the word Sheol. Sheol meant simply the place you go when you die. It means the ground. It can mean the pit. Because why? Because, well, that's where the bodies went. It was a place of no return. But it was intentionally vague in the thinking of the Old Testament, Sheol. It had no punishment attached to it. It had no morality attached to it. Everybody went to Sheol, good, bad, and ugly. Because why? Because, well, we all die and we're all buried in some form or fashion. We return to the dust. Sheol. They translated that word hell. It didn't have anything to do with punishment. It didn't have anything to do with eternity. It didn't have anything to do with an afterlife. It simply meant the grave, but they translated it hell. We looked at several passages where they did that. There is a Greek equivalent in the New Testament. The word Hades was used. The Greek word Hades is used every time the Hebrews talked about Sheol. And so you have the word Sheol, you have the word Hades. The King James people translated them both hell. Hades was a Greek concept. There was a Greek god named Hades who oversaw Hades. It was a place of departed spirits. It was a temporary place. It was not a permanent place. It was not a place of punishment. It was a place where you went when you died. It wasn't it wasn't as nice as the world. It wasn't as bright. It was dark. It was gloomy, but it was temporary. And later on, you would go to a better place. That was Hades. They translated it hell. There's another Greek word that was translated hell. Jesus used the word Gehenna. He talked about a place called Gehenna. He borrowed it intentionally from an actual physical place outside the city of Jerusalem called the Valley of Hinnom. Gehinnom, the Valley of Hinnom. The Valley of Hinnom in the Old Testament era was a place where the god Moloch was worshipped, a fire god. You worshipped him by throwing infants into the furnace. It was usually a furnace that was a grotesque, big mouth type thing, and as horrible as that sounds, you would throw an infant in there, and that's how you placated that god Moloch. That was carried on. It's just below the temple mount. It was carried on by practitioners of the religion of Moloch. Some of Solomon's wives were worshipers of Moloch. It's the dirty little Solomon secret that while he had the temple up on top, he allowed his many wives, hundreds, to have their shrines down below in the Valley of Hinnom, and prominent among them was the worship of this fire god Moloch. Jesus talked about a place he called Gehenna. It was in their era. They thought of it as a place of unpleasantness, but it was not a permanent place. Now, in fact, physically, the Valley of Hinnom was the garbage dump. It's where the refuse was thrown in Jesus' day. In prior times, it had been where these gods were worshipped, these fire gods were worshipped. But by Jesus' time, Paul's time, it's the city dump. It's where unclaimed bodies were thrown. It was a place of putrefaction. That's why when Jesus talks about it, he says where the worm does not die and the fire doesn't go out, because there were always smoldering things. In other words, he was saying that it's a place, it's a state that you don't want to be in if you're alienated from God. It's like you're in the Valley of Hinnom. The King James people translated it hell. There's one more Greek word, the word Tartarus. In the Greek system, Tartarus was a place where the gods, most especially the Titans, which were half god, half men, would be tormented for eternity. It's used only one time in the New Testament, and it's a reference to angels that will go to their eternal punishment. Go back to what we've talked about in Psalm 82, where divine beings, because they have abused their power over human beings, they have misused it, they have not championed the weak and the vulnerable, but they have done crooked things, they've abused their power, and at the end of Psalm 82, God says to these divine beings, these Elohim, you will die like men. You will be judged. I will take over from you, and that's the whole story of the plan of salvation, is God is reclaiming what these false gods have stolen. But he says, in the end, you will be judged. That's the reference that Tartarus is used in the New Testament. The one time it's used of divine punishment, eternal divine punishment, but not for humans, for these fallen angels, if you will. What we know in our study is the Elohim. So all of those words, all those 4 words, get translated in the King James Bible as hell. With all of the freight that had built up over time for this ancient Norse word, and all of these things had been added to it, from Zoroastrianism, from the ancient Near East, from Egypt, from a lot of places, and we'll go back and visit some of that tonight. And so when they talk about hell, that's what the King James people are thinking of. But it does not correspond to any of the 4 words that are in the Bible. None of which, except for one, talk about eternal punishment, and that one is talking about eternal punishment for angelic beings, not for humans. All of that gets balled up, and then along comes the imagery from Dante and Milton and Bosch and all of that, so that what we're looking at today, when most people talk about a popular idea of hell, that's what they're talking about. Now tonight, that was looking at what the Bible has to say. Tonight, I want us to look at some pagan views on hell, some other worldview ideas on hell that have had a big part in informing the way, on a popular basis, we think about hell. So let's dig in. Before we talk about these other worldviews, and you know what I mean by worldview, it's how you look at reality, okay? There are different kinds of worldviews, and maybe someday we'll do a study on worldview. There's a communist worldview. There are pagan worldviews. There are deistic worldviews, but there's also a Christian worldview. And the Christian view on reality is that creation is incarnational, that God has not only created all of this, but he inhabits all of this. And especially through the coming of Christ, we talk about creation being incarnational, that he lives in each one of us. That's why you see that phrase in the New Testament, to be in Christ and Christ in you. He's living his life in you. So the Christian worldview is an incarnational worldview, that God he's filling reality and he's filling us. But there are other worldviews. And I want us to take a look at some of those other worldviews and how they look at this whole issue of hell, okay? There are various ancient cultures and religions, and they have developed some very distinct concepts of the afterlife, particularly when it comes to punishment, okay? So let's take a look at it, because these are the things that inform what people mean today, beginning especially with the King James translators, who were brilliant people. They did great work. But they used one word for different concepts that overlapped, but also meant different things, you see. But they made it all mean one thing, and that's where our problem has come in. So all of these things, we'll take a look at some things that inform all of that. So let's take a kind of an overview here of the whole concept of hell in various ancient civilizations before Christianity. Mesopotamian. By that I mean the ancient Near East, okay? Babylon, Assyria, the Fertile Crescent, that part of the world. In ancient Mesopotamian ideas, mythology, they had the idea of an underworld. They called it Ker. And that was a place that was depicted as dark. It was a dreary place where all souls go after death, regardless of action in life, okay? It was ruled by a goddess who governed this shadowy area. And in it, the dead exist in a kind of a limbo state. They're like shades, and they don't have a lot of awareness, and they have very little activity, okay? This is where you go when you die in this system. They live on dust and a few scraps that humans may leave laying around, okay? Now, unlike other cultures that depict an afterlife, there's no, in the Mesopotamian idea, there's no strong concept of moral judgment or anything like that, or punishment. Good, bad, or ugly, the afterlife is uniformly bleak and joyless for everybody, okay? That's why you don't want to die, okay? Because it's just not going to be good. That's the Mesopotamian idea of hell, okay? It's kind of an everybody thing, but it has nothing to do with punishment at all. The Egyptian hell, a little bit different, more complex, more multifaceted with the Egyptians. And they have the potential in their afterlife for reward and punishment. Okay, that's a bigger part of it. It begins, you die, and then you begin with a passage through it's called Duat, I think D-U-A-T, is the way we would spell it. You go through this passage, and then you wind up in the realm of the dead, and along the way there's all kind of trials and judgments, and anyway, you have a ceremony at the end of that that's called the weighing of the heart ceremony. I told you the Egyptians are more complex with this. You have this weighing of the heart ceremony for every individual. It's overseen by the god Osiris. You may have heard that Egyptian god. And in this ceremony, the heart of the deceased person is weighed against a feather of another god, a god who's the symbol of truth and justice. There's a feather from that god, and your heart is weighed against that feather. Now, if your heart is heavier than the feather, that indicates a life of sin and imbalance, and you are devoured by another god, and your soul is condemned to oblivion. Okay? However, if your heart is lighter than the feather, then you get passage into what they call the field of reeds. It's kind of a paradise type. It's like earth, but better. And you can live in eternal peace and happiness. So with this, you get this either-or picture. In philosophy, it's called dualism. It's a dualistic picture. There's a really good and a really bad, okay? You get this view of the afterlife, and it underscores the Egyptians' idea that there's moral retribution, but there's also the possibility of eternal reward. Okay, so for the first time, you get this introduction of good place, bad place, all right? Egyptians. Let's take a look at the Dharmic religions. What we mean by that is religions that come from the Indian subcontinent. India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Nepal, those kind of places. The idea of you've heard of karma, good and bad. The Dharmic religions are very good and bad, very black and white, good and bad. And the idea of dharma is it's your moral obligations, your religious obligations, and if you observe those, then you're going to be okay, or you need to observe those to be okay. That's what we mean by the Dharmic we're talking about Buddhism, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, okay? Those are from that part of the world. Now in Buddhism, they're all kind of similar, but with a little bit of differences. There is a place of intense suffering, punishment, for those that have accumulated bad karma. This is the beginning of what I think of as scoreboard religion, okay? Which has even worked its way into the way a lot of people think about Christianity. If at the end of my life I've done more good things than bad things, I'll go to the good place. If I've done more bad things than good things, scoreboard, I'll go to the bad place. Years ago when we did faith, there's some people in here that did faith, we would go out and we had a little survey thing we would do. And one of the questions was something like, if you were to die today and go to heaven, and God were to ask you, why should I let you in heaven, what would you say? And very, very often, even from people that said they were lifelong members of churches, you would get a scoreboard answer. You would get a works answer. Well, if I've done more good things than bad things. This is the start of that, okay, in these dharmic religions. Okay, so the idea is there's a place of intense suffering and punishment for those that have accumulated a lot of bad karma, okay? However, it's not eternal. The damnation is not eternal. It's not permanent. A soul will endure the amount of punishment it needs until that negative karma is burned off or exhausted, after which they can be reborn into a better place. Okay, that's Buddhism. Hinduism also has a hell, and it uses the same word as Buddhism, Naraka. That's the place where the torment happens. Also temporary, where souls are punished, for sure, for their sins, but then they're reincarnated after that process, okay? So Naraka, this Hindu hell, it kind of functions as a mean for the soul to purify itself and so it'll have a better rebirth, okay? You messed up, but you get another run at it, okay? In Hinduism, this goes on for a long time. Like you're born, reborn, die, reborn, and so on. It takes a long time. Zoroastrianism, less well known, but it's one of those religions from that same part. And in this one, the righteous cross a bridge very easily, enter into paradise. The wicked, crossing the bridge, fall off the bridge into hell, the abyss, okay? And in Zoroastrianism, hell is a place of punishment for the wicked, but again, it's not eternal, not eternal. Over time, the soul can be purified, because remember, Zoroastrianism is all about fire. It's a religion of fire. And so the fire purifies. Eventually, you can rejoin the righteous in paradise because they have the idea that everybody ultimately will be redeemed because they are a very dualistic religion. And in their religion, good always triumphs over evil, okay? So knowing that about their system, the good will always triumph and everybody eventually makes it. Let's talk about hell in Greek mythology. This is something that has really informed the way a lot of people popularly think about hell too, and though most people aren't aware of it. In the Greek systems, as we said earlier, the underworld is known as Hades. That is one of the words that the New Testament uses because the New Testament is in Greek. In Greek mythology, Hades is ruled by Hades, the god of Hades. And it consists of several different regions. I won't go into all of it. But it includes places like, one place is called the Elysian Fields for the virtuous. Hades is just the place where the dead go. Good, bad, whatever. There are nice places like the fields, the Elysian Fields, for the virtuous, and there's Tartarus for the wicked gods, okay? Primarily for the wicked gods. And that is seen as a place of severe punishment for those that have committed really heinous crimes. If you know your Greek mythology, those gods were a bunch of nasty beings. They were all the time doing something hideous. That's where they went. Now, there's huge evidence, and we could take a lot of time to do it and run it down. We won't. That suggests that some of the earliest Christian thinkers, and I'm talking about the first, second, third, fourth centuries, adopted a lot of their concepts of what came to be called hell from Greek mythology. A lot of the imagery that later on gets repeated in places like the Inferno, Paradise Lost, in popular thinking, it comes from Greek mythology, not from the Bible. Some early Christian depictions of hell are strikingly similar, not to the Bible, but to these ancient Greek portrayals. And they often use identical Greek terminology. Okay? The Church Fathers, and we're going to talk more about the Church Fathers in a minute. Church Fathers are a group of people from the 1st to about the 5th century, maybe a little bit further, that were the first people, Church Fathers and Mothers, who were the first people to encounter this amazing gospel and to try and figure out how to communicate it. They're the people that originated the word Trinity to describe the relationship that is God, Father, Son, and Spirit. That's not a word you find in the Bible, but it's a word they developed to try and describe what they didn't have a vocabulary for. So we owe a lot to those early Christians. They helped us a lot to set things up and to think about, what the Bible's trying to tell us about the nature of God and all the rest of it. And we owe them a lot. But almost all of the early church fathers, just because of the time they lived in and where they lived, they were engaging with all kind of Greek ideas all day long. That's just the water they swam in. Not only Greek mythology and Greek terms, but also Greek philosophies. Most especially, the early church fathers were affected by a philosophy called Neoplatonism, the new Platonism, the new work of, a new take on Plato. I won't go into a lot of the detail on that, but they were super influenced by that. Actively engaged with that, actively embraced that. Some of the main church fathers, we'll talk about one by the name of Clement of Rome. We'll talk a little bit too about Augustine, sometimes we call him. Those people were super immersed in this Neoplatonism. And that was their philosophical framework. That was part of their worldview. And they wove these ideas together as they tried to explain what the New Testament is saying. They used these terms and thought in these terms. And one of the terms that's big in Neoplatonism is the idea of eternal punishment. Okay? That's just what they swam in. So they're working with the Bible, but this is just the way they talk. Okay? Let's talk about the Roman idea. So that was the Greek idea. The underworld shares, in the Roman ideas, shares a lot with the Greek concept. The Romans borrowed a lot from the Greeks. They push it a little bit further and they talk about demons that guide the dead to their final destinations. And the final destination, the Roman hell, is depicted as dark and shadowy, where souls are judged. And in the Roman afterlife, again, heavily influenced by Greek mythology and Greek philosophy, it includes an underworld known as Hades, or in Latin, the Inferi. We get our word inferno from that. And that's a realm that features the Elysian fields for the blessed, Tartarus for the damned. This is the first time the idea of Tartarus, which in the New Testament is a place where bad angels go. Psalm 82, right? But this is the first time that Tartarus is where humans go, is in the Roman system, okay? Until then, Christians didn't think of it that way. Romans did. And the Romans believed in a system of moral retribution where souls face rewards, they face punishment based on what you did on the earth, okay? Islam has also affected the way people talk in a popular way about hell, believe it or not. Because Islam affected the Christians, you see. In Islam, hell is a place of severe punishment for those who reject the faith, reject Islam, or who commit really big sins. It's very vividly described, very vividly described in the Quran, where it's talked about as having multiple levels and multiple forms of torment that are tailored to the sins that were committed. Dante is going to borrow from that idea with his 7 layers of hell that get worse and worse, you know. People that were just careless are at the top, not so bad. People that betrayed Christ are at the bottom. It's the worst, okay? Some of that is borrowed from the idea in Islam that there are these different kinds of torments that fit what you did, you know. If you were greedy, you will be boiled or something. You know, it'll fit whatever you did. Or rather, if you were burned up with lust, you'll be boiled, that kind of thing. That's out of Islam. What I hope you're beginning to see is that this idea that we popularly talk about of hell, most of it doesn't come from your Bible, which doesn't use the word at all. When it talks about the afterlife, it uses 4 words. Only one of them talks about eternal punishment, and that not for humans. Only Jesus talks about Gehenna, where the idea is it's a temporary. You may go there for some punishment, but it's temporary, okay? And it's ultimately for your eternal good. So those are the other worldviews, the other ideas on this whole concept of hell. Let me just stop, because that's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of content, a lot of data. Anybody have a reaction, question? Maybe I wasn't clear, clarification, whatever. Nothing? Got one more. The Jewish idea of hell was very vague. By the time of Jesus, there is an idea that the afterlife, there's a good place, there's a bad place. Again, you don't get a lot of that from the Old Testament. You won't find that in the Scriptures. It talks about Sheol. It talks about how if you belong to the Lord, there will be a forever aspect to it. But there's not a lot of description of heaven or a place that we would think of as hell in the Old Testament. But by Jesus' time, and you all know what we mean by Second Temple and all that now, ideas had begun to gel that did have a place of punishment and a place of reward. But the place of punishment in the Jewish system by Jesus' time was it's temporary. And like some of these other ideas, it probably is so that you can be improved. And whatever was wrong, you deal with it, but it's not a forever state. Okay? Let's talk about some of the among early Christians. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. We could, only because this is a real interest of mine. The early church fathers, the earliest Christians that were wrestling with all these ideas, and who is Jesus and his nature, and what's it mean that he's fully human, but he's also fully divine, and how do we express that, and what kind of nature do we have? Are we just bodies, or are we body and soul, or are we body, soul, and spirit? And what's the difference? These are all the concepts that they were working with. Nature of God, Father, Son, Spirit. What's that mean? What's that mean? What's the Son do that the Father doesn't do? And all that. These are the people that were working a lot of that out because they encountered it for the first time. And on the whole, they did a brilliant job. But I want you to see what they thought about this whole idea of what we call hell. Okay? There's a guy by the name of Clement of Rome. They call him Clement the First. He was the bishop of Rome in the 1st century. He is among what are known as the Apostolic Fathers. The Apostolic Fathers, and there are just a handful of those, are the earliest of the earliest. They're from the first century, the same century as the New Testament, and a little bit into the second century, into the 100s, early 100s. The Apostolic Fathers are people that were discipled by an apostle, okay? And Clement is among that very small select group. He wrote a couple of letters to the church in Corinth, just like Paul did. He's writing in Greek, and in one of his letters, here's what he says. Let us reflect how free from wrath he is, he's talking about God, how free from wrath God is toward all his creatures. I underscore the word all there, all his creatures. God does good to all, but most abundantly to us who have fled for refuge to his compassions. God is the all-merciful and beneficent Father. So you don't get a feeling of eternal torment or eternal punishment there, but he's pretty inclusive. Historians later on would remark on that and say he seemed to believe in the salvation of all mankind, Clement, okay? He uses an interesting word. It's the word we get our word eon from. And in his second letter, his word eon is sometimes translated as eternal, everlasting, but a more accurate translation of the word is age-long or for an age. And it's in that context that he's talking about people that have been bad. And they are punished for an eon. In other words, for an age long, pertaining to an age. There's another word that does mean eternal. It's the word adios. Well, sounds almost like adios. Adios, on the other hand, definitely means eternal, and it's used in the New Testament to describe God's power, but it is never used to describe God's punishment. God's punishment is used with the word eon, which means for an age or for a time. The implication being for a limited time. Could have used the word that meant eternal, but the only time the word eternal is used is to describe God's power in Romans 1:20. Okay? So that kind of shows you how Clement jibes with what the New Testament is doing. There's another apostolic father, Ignatius of Antioch. He was a disciple of the Apostle John. John discipled him. He was John's Thrive student, okay? And he has something to say. He says in one of his letters, and he writes a series of letters when he's on his way to being martyred in Rome. He's a political prisoner. They're taking him. And along the way, he writes a series of letters. He writes a letter to the Christians at a place called Magnesia. And he says this, "For as one who has been thought worthy of a divine and desirable name in those bonds which I bear about, I commend the churches in which I pray for a union both of the flesh and the spirit of Jesus Christ, who is the Savior of all men, but especially of them that believe, by whose blood you were redeemed, by whom you have known God, or rather have been known by him." Interesting phrase, Jesus Christ, who is the Savior of all men. So that's his take. There's another, Polycarp. He was a bishop of a place called Smyrna, which you read about in the Bible in Asia Minor. He has this to say, "You threaten me with the fire which burns for an hour." This is what he tells he's burned to death. And right before the torturers start the fire, they've got him tied to it. He says, you threaten me with the fire which burns for an hour and after a little is extinguished, but you are ignorant of the fire that is coming and judgment that is age long. Not eternal, but age long. Okay? Clearly, he had a belief in some form of judgment. Polycarp did. Other early Christian texts the same, but again, that age-long word, long duration perhaps, but it suggests that though it may be severe, it is not necessarily eternal. I'm just showing you what these earliest Christians said, okay? Before they're influenced by Mesopotamian and Egyptian and Greek and Roman and Islam, which is still several hundred years off. This is what they were thinking, okay? With their Bible, with their New Testament, this is what they're thinking. Before the King James guys come along and say hell for all those words, this is what they're thinking, okay? This guy by the name of Justin Martyr, he's famous for a very robust defense of Christianity. He leaves a couple different works. Their argument, he presents an argument trying to convince the Roman emperor to stop persecuting Christians. That's his big thing. And in one of his works, he says, then shall they, he's talking about these people that don't come to Christ, they shall be punished with age-long punishment, and not like Plato says, for a period of 1,000 years only, but age-long. Okay? So there it is again, not the permanent idea. He appears that he's emphasizing the gravity of divine justice, but he's suggesting that the time is undefined, variable, maybe proportionate to the sin, but he never talks about it as eternal. Interesting. There are more. I could run through that list. If you want, we can. We don't have to do it this week. But all of them essentially are saying the same thing for about the first 300 years. Along comes, in the 400s, a guy by the name of Augustine. When church history people talk about this guy, they say Augustine is a city in Florida. His name is Augustine. So, Augustine. Augustine is kind of a pivotal figure. Now, I want to show you something. All these books with a green spine, those are all Augustine. And that's not even half. That's about a third of what he's left. He was prolific. He was brilliant. He was a great word stylist. He was a great orator. He was a bishop, which means he was over a number of churches in North Africa. He was an African. He was a Roman. We've got it. We think along racial lines and ethnic lines. The Romans didn't. Romans could be anybody from anywhere. Paul was a Roman, though he was a Jew from Tarsus. Augustine was a Roman, though he was an African. Okay? He was brilliant. He had been trained in the finest academies in Rome, in the city of Rome. He was a student of the greatest of the Roman orators, Cicero. He didn't know him personally, but he absorbed all of his work and memorized it. And Cicero is one of the greatest orators that ever lived. We still study him. His mother, Augustine's mother, was a Christian. Monica was a thoroughgoing Christian. And for many, many years into his adulthood, she prayed for Augustine, who was a mess. He was a drinker, a carouser, a womanizer. He was brilliant. He was being trained to be somebody important in the court at Rome. And he had lots of good connections. And he was a great teacher and, as I said, a great orator. But he drank and womanized and ran around and cheated and had babies. And he was a mess. He was a party animal mess. But he was brilliant. Monica was praying for him the whole time. He had a dramatic conversion to Christ, a remarkable supernatural conversion to Christ. He was in a garden of his mother's house one day. He was in his late 20s, and he was depressed. He knew his life was going nowhere. He was contemplating suicide, and he heard a little kid singing some little kid's song the wall over from him, and the little kid's song was something like, take up and read, take up and read, take up and read. And he went in the house and he found his mother's book of Romans, and he read a passage, and he said he was totally transformed. And his life was completely changed, and he became eventually a church leader. It's still the story of his conversion is called his Confessions. It's still very readable and reads very modern, and there's some really good translations, English translations. I've read it 2 or 3 times. It's phenomenal. It's the first psychological treatment of a person, and it just reads so modern. Anyway, it's very, very good. It's about how he came to Christ and how that changed him. He's absolutely brilliant. His greatest work is a work called The City of God. It's the very first history of the whole world, of why the world is like it is. It's more than history. It's what's called historiography. It's an explanation of why history is the way it is. And it still works today. It's brilliant. What I'm saying is that when Augustine says something, because he left behind so much, he buries everybody else. I mean, nobody wrote as much as he did, spoke as much as he did, had as much influence as he did, way outside of his geography there in North Africa. And after his death, he continued for centuries to be the dominant figure. He's still the dominant figure today. There's still many churches are super influenced. You've heard the ideas of predestination and, eternal security. That's him. That's him. He's the one who articulated that. Very logical mind. Everything is very logical with him. Very convincing. A lot of his work is what we call apologetics. He's convincing you of a point. Sometimes his points are wrong. And he was the very first one to talk about this whole idea that the afterlife is a place where you're punished forever. He is the first one among all these early church fathers. None of them had the idea that punishment was eternal. He is the first one to articulate what's called ECT. ECT can stand for electroconvulsive therapy, shock therapy, okay, which we don't do anymore. But it also stands for eternal conscious torment. He is the first one, Augustine, he is the first one to articulate this idea of eternal conscious torment. It does not appear before him. It does not appear in the New Testament. It does not appear in the Old Testament. It does not appear in all these church fathers. And we could have gone on to others that are brilliant. Jerome was the first translator of the Bible out of Greek into another tongue. I mean, all these people are brilliant, but none of them had the idea that there was eternal conscious torment until Augustine. Let me read you a couple things. It's not an exaggeration that he is the originator of that idea. He's also the originator of ideas like original sin, total depravity, predestination. He is crucial when it comes to the Middle Ages theology and Reformation theology. He influenced people like John Calvin, my good friend Tracy, who pastors the church up here. That church and many churches, Presbyterian churches, some Baptist churches, are very steeped in the ideas of Augustine. Okay? It goes back to him. Very influenced. The Catholic Church is built on Augustine. That's why it's very logical. And it's very hard to discuss things with a Catholic person who knows Catholicism because it's all logical. Yeah, well, if this, then this. If this, then this. Goes back to Augustine. He's the originator of so many of those ideas, and he's the originator of this idea of endless torment in hell. Let me read a quote. He says, "There are very many in our day who, though not denying the Holy Scriptures, do not believe in endless torment." Now, that's quite a confession. He's saying that there are lots of Christians, and he's talking about Christian leaders, other bishops, and he's saying there are many in our day that do not believe in ECT. In fact, the majority didn't believe. He did. And because he has left behind such a body of work, he carries the day. He carries the day. Just by sheer volume, he carries the day. Also because he's a brilliant writer. The doctrine of eternal conscious torment was popularized by Augustine. He presents hell as a place of unending physical suffering, torture. Now, in his day and since, his view has been criticized for portraying God as narcissistic, sadistic, a psychopath, who gets pleasure from perpetual pain. And that idea is in huge conflict with the portrayal of God as a loving, merciful God, obviously. But it's Augustine. It's him. His perspectives, and he did not live around any of the other church fathers. He's away in North Africa, modern-day Tunisia, North Africa. So he's not really in contact with any of these others that were around his time, people like Athanasius and Jerome. They were in other places. So he wasn't influenced by any of them. But he had tremendous influence on the church that followed, the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church, the Protestant churches, where his ideas have become the prevailing doctrines across a whole lot of different denominations. That's where it's come from, is him, down to the present time. So I think I'm going to stop there with Augustine. We'll pick up next week, because what has happened, and I want you to see, is that in the early church, with all of these figures and many, many more, there was not one idea about a lot of things. There were multiple takes on different things about Jesus, the Gospels, the Bible, the resurrection, what's it mean? There wasn't just one Christianity. And the way it's looked at is that in different locations, there were different, what they think of as schools of thought. And so we'll pick up next week in Antioch, which is modern-day Syria, in Alexandria, which was in northern Egypt, Caesarea. We know Caesarea in the Bible. It's on the coast near Israel. Eastern Syria, Asia Minor, which is where the churches of Revelation were. In Hippo, which is North Africa, Augustine was the bishop of Hippo, modern-day Tunisia. There were these different schools, and each of these different schools had a different idea on what the afterlife was like. Most especially the punishment part and how long it lasted. So we'll pick up there next week, because we've covered enough. But and we'll sign off. We'll say goodbye to the people who are watching online. We're going to do a bonus round.